We started to talk about experimental research a few weeks ago, and since then we've covered quite a few different types of experiments. For example, we talked about the between subjects design and the within subjects design. Those are the two major types. We also talked about a few different types of between subjects designs. For example, we talked about the independent groups and matched pairs designs. We also talked about the experimental group control group design and the two experimental groups design. So we have covered quite a few different types of experiments, but what all of these different types that we've covered have in common is they all have one independent variable. They're all designed to test the effect of one thing on one other thing. And it turns out that an experiment doesn't have to have just one independent variable. An experiment could have two, three, or even four independent variables. And it turns out that there's a special word for an experiment with more than one independent variable, and that word is factorial design. And that's the topic we're getting into today. So, a factorial design is an experiment with more than one independent variable, and today we're going to begin to talk about the details of how a person does a factorial design. But before we get into that, I want to spend a few minutes talking about why someone would want to do an experiment with more than one independent variable, a factorial design, rather than just a simple experiment with just one independent variable. And, well, when a person does an experiment with just one independent variable, it's not very satisfying for the researcher. It leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And to help you see what I mean, I'll share one or two examples. So imagine for a moment that someone wanted to do an experiment to test the effect of the presence of an audience on some type of task that they're observing, like let's say basketball or a musician playing in a band, or really just any task that could be observed. And imagine that the researcher wants to know if the audience, if the presence of the audience causes the observed person to do better or worse at the task that they're performing. And imagine that the researcher has two groups of people randomly assigned, and one group, one group plays basketball with an audience observing, and the other group plays basketball with no audience observing. And imagine that the group that's observed does worse at basketball, and the group that isn't being observed does better at basketball. Well, if that's the outcome, then it suggests, or it does show some evidence that that the presence of an audience causes worse performance on a task that's being observed. But it it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. It doesn't tell us everything that we would want to know about that topic. For example, uh, we still wouldn't know if the type of people in the audience makes a difference. Um, so the it could be that one type of audience causes anxiety or stress, whereas another type of audience doesn't cause anxiety or stress. Maybe if the audience is full of uh, judgmental people who are likely to be evaluating the person uh, or judging their performance, that might cause more stress. Also, the type of task that the person is performing might make a difference. So, an audience might have a different effect on an easy task than on a difficult task. And studies have actually shown that the difficulty of the task does matter. And it actually turns out that an audience tends to cause a person to do better on an easy task and to do worse on a difficult task. Because if it's an easy task, the audience kind of helps energize the person and helps them. Well, based on what I've heard, I think the audience helps energize the person and helps them focus better on that easy task. Whereas if it's a difficult task, the audience causes stress overload, or the stress becomes too much, and it causes the person to choke basically and not do well at the task. So, like I said, um, if you do an experiment with just one independent variable and you just test one thing on something else, um, it's not going to answer every question that you might have because um, the world isn't that simple, basically. Um, well, there is, in most real life situations, there isn't just one factor or one variable that matters. There are several different variables that are all involved. So let's now move into my first example of an experiment with, well, a factorial design. But first, I wanted you to think about this for a minute. So imagine that two researchers are running two different experiments at the same time. And in the first experiment, the researcher is testing the effect of hours of exercise on calorie consumption. And this researcher has one group exercising 2 hours and the other group exercising 4 hours. And the researcher is recording the number of calories they eat during the day. And in this other experiment, the researcher is testing the effect of sleep on calorie consumption. And one group is sleeping 6 hours, and the other group is sleeping 8 hours. And once again, the researcher is recording the number of calories that the people are consuming during the day. Well, what I want you to think about is there a more efficient way to do these two experiments? Or is there a way that these two experiments could be combined into one experiment to save time and effort? Well, it turns out that there actually is, and you could combine these two experiments into a factorial design with two independent variables. So instead of doing these two separate experiments, a researcher could do one experiment to test the effect of hours of exercise and hours of sleep on calorie consumption. And that would be a factorial design. And there's actually more advantages to doing it that way, other than it just being more efficient and faster. And the the main advantage of doing the factorial design rather than the two separate experiments is the fact that the researcher could look at combinations of exercise and sleep. So in the factorial design, the researcher could um, have one group exercising 2 hours with 6 hours of sleep, and let's say another group exercising 2 hours with 8 hours of sleep, and then one group exercising 4 hours with 6 hours of sleep. Basically, the researcher could look at all possible combinations of exercise and sleep, and that couldn't be done if it was two separate experiments. So yeah, the main advantage of doing the factorial design is you can look at all possible combinations of conditions, which you can't do if it's just two separate experiments like I have on the screen here. So let's look at let's look at a visual diagram of what that experiment would look like if it was combined into a factorial design, or or at least what it might look like. So here we have hours of exercise, and we have two levels, 0 hours and 2 hours. And here we have hours of sleep with its two levels, 6 hours and 8 hours. And here inside the square, we have four boxes. And these four boxes are just meant to be all possible combinations of exercise and sleep. So this first box is 0 hours of exercise with 6 hours of sleep. This next box is 2 hours of exercise with 6 hours of sleep. This next box down here is 0 hours with 8 hours. And finally, over here at the bottom right, we have 2 hours with 8 hours. So this factorial design right here has, it has two independent variables, hours of exercise and hours of sleep. Each independent variable has two levels because we have two levels of exercise and two levels of sleep. And we have a total of 4 conditions in the experiment. Um, we have, because each box is a condition, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we basically have 4 situations in the experiment. And imagine that we have 20 people who want to participate in this experiment. Well, what we would probably do is randomly assign 5 people to each condition. So 5, 5, 5, and 5, and 1/4 of the participants would go to each box, and then we would have our factorial design. So a factorial design has, um, well, first of all, it has more than one independent variable, and each independent variable has at least 2 levels, and the conditions are just all possible combinations of the levels that are being tested. So here, in this case, it's all possible combinations of, of the 2 levels of hours of exercise and the 2 levels of sleep. Here I'm just showing it's 1/4 of participants to each box. And just like in any other experiment, the variable that's being measured or recorded to reach a conclusion is the dependent variable. So in this case, if the researcher is comparing these groups on how many calories they're eating or consuming, and the researcher is measuring each person's calorie consumption, then that's the dependent variable. It's number of calories consumed. And I want to quickly get into the notation of a factorial design. So this would actually be called a 2 by 2 factorial design. And let me explain why. This first number right here is the number of levels of the first independent variable. So in this experiment, the first independent variable is hours of exercise, and it has 2 levels because we have one group exercising 0 hours and another group exercising 2 hours. So it's 2 levels of exercise. This other number right here is the number of levels of the second independent variable. So in this experiment, the second independent variable is hours of sleep, and it has 2 levels, 6 and 8. So basically, this is just 2 levels of sleep. So we have 2 levels of exercise and 2 levels of sleep. Like I said, it's just the number of levels of independent number 1 and the number of levels of independent number 2. And when you multiply the 2 numbers, you get the number of conditions. So 2 times 2 equals 4, and obviously we have 4 conditions in here. So it's levels of IV1 times levels of IV2 equals number of conditions. And I want you to try to imagine for a moment what a 3 by 2 factorial design would look like. Well, if it was 3 by 2, that would mean 3 levels of IV1 and 2 levels of IV2, which would be it would have 3 columns and 2 rows, and it would have 6 conditions because 3 times 2 equals 6. So let's imagine for a moment that this experiment was testing 3 different levels of exercise. So let's say 0 hours, 2 hours, and 4 hours. And let's imagine that we still have 2 levels of sleep, 6 and 8. Well, if that's the case, then we would have 3 columns and 2 rows, and it would be 6 conditions or 6 situations. That would be a 3 by 2 factorial design. So that's the notation of a factorial design. And now let's just get into a little bit of vocabulary here. So I said that in a factorial design, you include all possible combinations of conditions, and each combination is called a cell. So let's look back at this diagram here of our first factorial design. Each of these four conditions is called a cell. So we have cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, and cell 4. And let's try to see if we can give a name to each of these cells. Well, these would be the names right here. So our first cell is 0 hours of exercise with 6 hours of sleep. The next cell is 0 hours with 8 hours. The third cell is 2 hours with 6 hours. And the fourth cell is 2 hours with 8 hours. So these are the four cells. And now let's talk about some of the statistics that are calculated in a factorial design. So in a factorial design, you have marginal means that are calculated, which are the means of the rows and the means of the columns. And you have cell means, which are the means of the cells. So now let's add some numbers into our picture right here. So imagine that this experiment that we've been talking about has been done, and the researcher has recorded each person's calorie consumption for the day. And imagine that the experiment has a total of 8 people, so 2 people in each cell, basically. So 2 people over here, 2 people are exercising 0 hours with 6 hours of sleep. 2 people over here are exercising 2 hours with 6 hours of sleep, and so on. And so if the researcher added, well, once again, I want to remind you that each number is the number of calories consumed for the day. That's what's being measured. So what this is saying here is that person 1 ate 1,000 calories, or consumed 1,000 calories during that day of the study, and person 2 consumed 1,400 calories on the day of the study. Let's imagine that the researcher added the four numbers in column 1 and divided the total by 4. So basically, imagine that the researcher calculated the mean of all 4 people who exercised 0 hours. Well, in this case, that would come out to 1,200, and it would be a marginal mean. And in this case, it would be the marginal mean of 0 hours of exercise, which is really just another way of saying that it's the mean of all of the people who didn't exercise. And now imagine that the researcher calculated the mean of all 4 people in column 2, the mean of all 4 people who exercised 2 hours. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be the marginal mean of 2 hours of exercise, and that would be another marginal mean. So in a 2 by 2 factorial design, you have a marginal mean for column 1 and a marginal mean for column 2. You also have row marginal means. So imagine that this person who did this study calculated the mean of all 4 people in row 1. That would be the marginal mean for 6 hours of sleep. That's because it's just basically the mean of all 4 people with 6 hours of sleep. Because row 1 is 6 hours of sleep. Now imagine that the researcher calculated the mean of all 4 people in row 2. Well, that would be the marginal mean of row 2, and it would just be the marginal mean of 8 hours of sleep, because in row 2, there are 4 people who all got 8 hours of sleep, and their mean is just the marginal mean of 8 hours of sleep. So overall, you have marginal means for column 1 and column 2, and you also have marginal means for row 1 and row 2. And if you, well, in this experiment right here, if you compared the column marginal means, what you would be doing is just comparing 0 hours of exercise with 2 hours of exercise. You would be just comparing those two levels of exercise to see which one led to more calorie consumption. And if you compared the two row marginal means, what you would be doing is just comparing 6 hours with 8 hours of sleep to see which level of sleep caused more calorie consumption. So what I want you so what I'm getting at here is the um, the the two column marginal means are like basically are just like the results of a two group experiment, and the row marginal means are also like the results of a two group experiment. So if you compare the two column means down here, you're really just um, pretending that this is or you're just acting as if this was a two group experiment, in which one group exercised and the other group didn't exercise. And if you compare the two row means, well, you're just acting as if it's a two group experiment with two different sleep conditions. Um, Now let's look at the cell means. So the cell means are actually a little bit more interesting because they let you look at the means of specific combinations. Um, for example, if you calculate the mean of cell 1 right here, you can actually look at the combination of 0 hours of exercise with 6 hours of sleep. So here you can actually if you calculate cell means, it allows you to break things down and look at exact combinations of conditions. So each cell mean is just the mean of the box. It's the mean of the cell, basically. So if you add these two numbers in the first box and divide by 2, you get the mean of person 1 and person 2, and it's a cell mean. It's 1200, the mean of cell 1. If you calculate the mean of persons 3 and 4 by adding and dividing by 2, you get 1800, and it's the mean of cell 2. Here we have the mean of cell 3, and here we have the mean of cell 4. Um, so overall, um, when you you have marginal and cell means. If you calculate the column marginal means down here, it allows you to compare the two columns and look at the effect of the first IV. If you calculate the row marginal means, it allows you to compare the two rows and look at the effect of IV2. And if you calculate these cell means, it allows you to break things down and look at specific combinations of conditions and compare those combinations with each other.